You can tell a system is about to fail by the way it hesitates before it lies. Daniel Brooks didn't mean to say it out loud, but the words slipped anyway, quiet, almost swallowed by the low hum of climate control and polished silence that filled the glass lobby of Hale Dynamics, a place where everything was designed to look flawless, even when it wasn't. He stood there in a faded navy delivery jacket, one hand still holding the insulated bag against his hip, the other loosely gripping the receipt he hadn't yet handed over, his eyes fixed on the massive digital display. Mounted behind the reception desk where lines of data flickered just a fraction too slow, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for someone who had spent too many nights watching broken systems try to pretend they were still working. The receptionist glanced at him like he had interrupted something sacred, her expression tightening just slightly. "You're here to drop off lunch," she said, her tone smooth but edged with quiet dismissal. "Not audit our infrastructure." Daniel nodded. Once, polite, stepping forward to place the bag down exactly where she pointed, not arguing, not explaining, just doing the job he came to do. But his eyes didn't leave the screen, not because he wanted attention, but because something about the pattern felt wrong, like a rhythm skipping a beat, like a machine trying too hard to keep up appearances. Behind him, a pair of engineers laughed softly, not cruel, just certain. The kind of certainty that comes from never having to question whether you belong in a room. Daniel exhaled slowly, almost turning to leave, almost letting it go, because he had learned a long time ago that speaking up in rooms like this usually cost more than it gave back. But then the screen flickered again, just once, and that was enough. "Your query loop's stacking wrong," he said, quieter this time, more to himself than anyone else, but the room heard it anyway. The laughter stopped, not replaced with curiosity, but with something sharper, disbelief. One of the engineers turned, eyebrows raised. "Excuse me?" Daniel shifted his weight, already regretting the moment. "It's probably nothing," he said, calm, steady. "Just looks like your system's choking itself." A pause followed, longer than it should have been, the kind that stretches just enough to make everyone aware of it. The receptionist straightened, clearly deciding whether to ignore him or escalate, when a voice cut through the space, low, controlled, and impossible to overlook. "Who said that?" The room didn't move at first, but then it did, subtly, like gravity had shifted. Daniel turned, and that's when he saw her, standing just beyond the glass doors that led to the executive floor. Victoria Hale, composed, precise, her presence not loud but absolute. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at him, not with irritation, not with amusement, but with something far more unsettling. Focus. Daniel felt it immediately, the difference between being dismissed and being seen, and for a brief second, he wished he had just stayed quiet, because attention like that didn't come lightly in places like this, and it never came without a cost. He straightened slightly, not defensive, just present. "I did," he said, simple, no apology in it, just truth. The room held its breath without realizing it, and somewhere between the flicker of a failing system and the silence of people who suddenly didn't know what would happen next, something shifted, small, almost invisible, but real enough that it could not be undone. No one stepped in to rescue the moment. Not the receptionist, not the engineers, not even the quiet hum of the building that seemed to hold its breath along with everyone else. Victoria Hale did not raise her voice, did not repeat her question. She simply took a few steps forward, heels measured against the marble floor, each step controlled, deliberate, until she stood close enough that Daniel could see the reflection of the data screen in her eyes, sharp lines of code flickering across a gaze that did not blink easily. "You said the system is choking itself," she repeated, not as a challenge, but as a confirmation. Daniel gave a small nod, not eager, not hesitant, just steady. "Yes, ma'am," he answered, his voice even, the kind of tone that did not try to impress and did not try to disappear either. One of the engineers let out a short breath, half laugh, half disbelief. "This is not a conversation we need to have with a delivery guy," he said, folding his arms like the conclusion had already been reached. Victoria did not look at him, not even for a second. Her attention remained fixed on Daniel, and that alone shifted something in the room, subtle but undeniable, like a door closing somewhere behind them. "What exactly did you see?" she asked. Daniel hesitated for the first time, not because he did not know, but because he understood the weight of speaking in a place where every word could be measured against you. He glanced once at the screen, then back at her. Your system is looping requests without prioritizing load, he said, choosing his words carefully. Keeps stacking instead of resolving. So it looks stable until it suddenly is not. Silence followed, deeper this time. One of the engineers shook his head, already dismissing it. That is not how our architecture works. He replied quickly, almost too quickly. Daniel did not argue. He simply nodded once. Then maybe it is not supposed to, he said, calm, not defensive, just honest. Victoria studied him for a moment longer, not searching for flaws, but for something else, consistency perhaps, or truth that did not try to prove itself. Then without turning, she extended a hand toward the glass doors. Come with me, she said. The words simple, but they landed heavier than any command. The receptionist blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. The engineer straightened. Victoria, we have a team working on this already, he added, a hint of urgency slipping through his controlled tone. She stopped just short of the door and turned her head slightly, not enough to face him fully, but enough to make the room feel the shift in authority. Then they can watch, she said, and that was all. Daniel felt every eye in the room follow him as he picked up the delivery bag and set it aside. Careful, precise, like everything else he did. He wiped his hands once on his jacket, not out of nerves, but habit, then stepped forward, each movement unhurried, not because he was confident, but because rushing had never helped him survive rooms like this. The glass doors opened with a soft sound, and as he crossed through, the air felt different, quieter, colder, like stepping into a place where mistakes were not loud, but permanent. Victoria walked ahead without looking back, trusting that he would follow, and he did, not because he belonged there, but because for the first time since he walked in, someone had asked him to stay. The executive floor did not feel louder. It felt quieter in a way that made every small sound more noticeable. The faint click of shoes, the distant hum of servers behind sealed walls, the soft pulse of machines doing work no one saw, but everyone depended on. Daniel stepped into the room and immediately understood that this was where decisions were made without needing to be explained. A long glass table stretched across the center, screens mounted along the walls, each one displaying different streams of data that moved with controlled urgency. Victoria stopped beside one of the terminals and gestured toward it without ceremony. This is where it started, she said, her tone even, not dramatic, just precise. Daniel moved closer, not touching anything yet, just looking, the way he always did first, taking in the structure before the surface. Behind him, the door opened again. A small group entered, engineers, analysts, people who carried authority in the way they stood. None of them spoke, but their presence filled the space with quiet resistance. Daniel could feel it, the doubt, the question that hung in the air without being asked. He ignored it, not out of confidence, but because he had learned that attention could be a distraction. He focused on the screen, lines of code, system logs, performance graphs, all moving, all alive, but something in the rhythm was off, like a heartbeat skipping just enough to matter. He leaned slightly closer, eyes narrowing, not strained, just attentive. It is not failing yet, he said, almost to himself. Victoria watched him, arms relaxed at her sides. But it will, she replied, not questioning, just completing the thought. Daniel nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then finally reached for the keyboard. His hands hovered for a second, not hesitating, just aligning, like someone remembering a pattern rather than learning it. The room stayed silent. No instructions, no countdown, just the quiet expectation of a moment that no one was willing to define yet. Daniel began typing, not fast, not slow, but steady, each keystroke intentional, the kind of rhythm that came from understanding rather than guessing. He opened layers of the system one by one, not jumping ahead, not trying to impress, just following the path the problem had already created. Behind him, one of the engineers shifted, arms tightening slightly, watching closely now, not dismissing anymore, but not believing either. Daniel paused, not because he was stuck, but because he was listening, not to the room, but to the system, the way it responded, the delay between request and resolution. the subtle strain hidden behind polished metrics. He exhaled slowly, then adjusted a section of code. Small changes, nothing dramatic, just removing weight where it did not belong, redirecting flow where it had been forced. The screens flickered once, then steadied, not in a dramatic burst, but in a quiet correction. Like something finally allowed to breathe. No one spoke, not immediately. The graphs shifted, numbers recalculated, response times dropped, not sharply, but consistently, the kind of change that could not be faked. Daniel leaned back slightly, hands resting away from the keyboard now. His job, at least for this moment, done. He did not turn around, did not look for approval. He simply watched the system settle into its new rhythm. Behind him, the silence changed. It was no longer resistance. It was something else, something closer to recognition. And in that space, where no one rushed to speak and no one knew exactly what to say, Victoria took a single step forward, her eyes still on the screen, but her attention no longer on the system alone. No one clapped, no one congratulated him, and somehow that made the moment heavier, more real, the kind of silence that did not come from confusion, but from understanding that something undeniable had just happened. One of the analysts leaned closer to the screen, eyes scanning the updated metrics, as if searching for a flaw that could return things to the way they were. But the numbers held steady, clean, efficient, no spikes, no strain, just a system finally moving the way it was supposed to. The engineer who had spoken earlier shifted his stance, his arms no longer crossed, his posture no longer guarded. But he still said nothing, because there was nothing left to argue. Daniel remained where he was, not claiming the space, not stepping away from it either, just present, like he had done what needed to be done and nothing more. Victoria watched the screen for a few seconds longer, then slowly turned her head toward him, her expression unchanged on the surface, but something beneath. It had shifted, something quieter, less certain of its previous assumptions. How long would it have taken before it failed? She asked, her voice calm, not dramatic. Daniel considered the question, not rushing to answer. Maybe a few hours, he said, then added. Maybe less if traffic spiked. She nodded slightly, absorbing that without reaction. But the room felt it, the weight of what that meant, the cost that had been waiting just beneath the surface, unseen. Until now, she looked back at the screen once more, then asked, "And what did you change?" Daniel glanced at the code, then back at her. "Not much," he replied. "Simple. I just stopped it from fighting itself." A faint shift moved through the room. Not laughter, not disbelief, but something closer to respect that had not been there before. Victoria studied him again, longer this time, not evaluating his answer, but the way he carried it. No pride, no performance, just clarity. "You speak like you have done this before," she said. Daniel gave a small shrug, almost unnoticeable. "Not here," he answered, and that was all. No explanation, no resume offered, just a boundary drawn without force. The room stayed quiet, but the silence had changed again. It was no longer about whether he belonged. It was about understanding who he was. Victoria stepped closer to the terminal, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, not claiming ownership, just grounding herself in the moment. "What is your name?" she asked. Daniel met her gaze, steady. "Daniel Brooks," he said. She repeated it once, softly, as if placing it somewhere intentional, then nodded, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. Behind them, the system continued running, smooth, stable, almost invisible now that it no longer demanded attention. And in that quiet, where nothing else needed to be fixed and no one else needed to speak, the distance between a delivery man and a chief executive officer felt smaller than it had just minutes before, not erased, but no longer absolute. Victoria looked at him. One more time, not with curiosity this time, but with something more deliberate, something that suggested this moment was not going to end where it began. "Do you have somewhere you need to be?" she asked, her tone even, but the question carried more weight than it seemed. Daniel paused for a fraction of a second, then answered honestly. "I have another delivery in 20 minutes, he said, and for the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of her expression, not visible to everyone, but real enough to matter. Victoria did not respond immediately, and that pause carried more weight than any quick decision ever could. She looked at him as if measuring something that could not be written down on paper, not his skills, not what he had just done, but the way he stood there after doing it, without asking for recognition, without trying to stay longer than necessary, just ready to leave as if the moment belonged to the work and not to him. 20 minutes, she repeated softly, almost to herself, then glanced at the wall clock, precise, silent, expensive in a way that did not need to be explained. How far? She asked. Daniel followed her glance for a second, calculating without effort. About 12 blocks, he said. Traffic will make it closer to 15 minutes if I walk fast. One of the analysts let out a quiet breath, the kind people release when they realize something important is slipping away. But Victoria did not look at them. She kept her focus on Daniel, then made a small motion, with her hand toward the terminal. Can you stay 5 more minutes? She asked, not as a command, but as a question that still carried authority. Daniel hesitated, not because he did not want to help, but because time, for him, was not flexible. It was measured in schedules, in deliveries, in promises that could not be casually adjusted. He glanced once toward the door, then back at her. 5 minutes, he said. Simple. And that was enough. Victoria nodded once and stepped aside slightly, giving him space again, not hovering, not directing, just allowing him to move the way he needed to. Daniel turned back to the system, his hands returning to the keyboard, not with urgency, but with quiet intention. He navigated through the layers he had already touched, not redoing the work, just reinforcing it, smoothing edges that might cause future strain, small adjustments, barely visible to anyone who did not know where to look, but each one placed with care. Behind him, the room remained still, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood that speaking now would break something that did not need to be broken. Victoria watched again, but differently this time, not observing a stranger, but paying attention to a process she had not considered before, the patience, the restraint, the refusal to rush even when time was limited. Daniel paused once, then made one final change, a quiet line of code that redirected a path no one else had noticed was misaligned. The system responded almost immediately, not dramatically, just cleaner, lighter, as if a weight had been removed that it had been carrying for too long. Daniel leaned back slightly, his hands resting at his sides. That should hold, he said, not claiming certainty, just offering his best. Victoria stepped closer, her eyes scanning the screen again, the numbers holding steady, consistent, reliable. She exhaled slowly, almost imperceptible, then looked at him. You just prevented a failure that would have cost us more than most people make in a lifetime, she said, her voice calm, but the meaning clear. Daniel nodded once, not dismissing it, but not absorbing it either. I just fixed what I saw, he replied, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to add that would make it more true. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, reminding him of the world outside this room, the one that still expected him to keep moving. Daniel glanced toward it, then back at her. I should go, he said, and there was no hesitation in it, just responsibility. Victoria held his gaze for a second longer, then reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out a small card. Plain, understated, she placed it on the table between them and slid it slightly in his direction. When your shift ends, she said, call me. No explanation, no promise, just an opening. Daniel looked at the card, then at her, not surprised, not eager, just thoughtful. He picked it up carefully, like it was something that mattered, and slipped it into his jacket. I will, he said, and with that, he turned and walked toward the door, not rushing, not looking back, just leaving the way he had entered, quietly. But this time, the room did not feel the same after he was gone. The elevator doors closed with a soft, controlled sound that barely echoed, and for a moment Daniel stood alone inside the mirrored space, the reflection staring back at him looking exactly the same as it had that morning, same jacket, same worn edges, same quiet expression, but something underneath had shifted, not in a way anyone else could see, but enough that he felt it in the way he exhaled, slow, steady, like releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. The building moved around him, floors passing without sound, numbers lighting up and disappearing again, and in that brief descent, the world he had just stepped out of began to feel distant, like a place that existed behind glass, real, but not where he lived. The doors opened and the lobby greeted him again with its polished calm. But this time the silence felt different. Eyes followed him, not openly, not in a way that could be called out, but he could feel it, subtle, questioning. The receptionist who had dismissed him earlier did not speak, but her posture had changed, straighter, more aware, as if she was no longer sure where to place him in her understanding of the room. Daniel did not slow down, did not acknowledge it. He simply walked to where he had left the delivery bag, picked it up with the same care as before, and adjusted the strap over his shoulder, routine grounding him in something familiar. Outside, the city air hit differently, warmer, louder, filled with movement that did not pause for anyone. Cars passing, people walking, the rhythm of a world that did not care what had just happened inside a building a few feet behind him. Daniel checked the time, then his route. Calculating again, without effort, 15 minutes had turned into 12, still enough if he kept pace. He started walking, not rushing, but efficient. Each step measured, not wasted. The card in his jacket sat quietly against his chest, not heavy, but present, like a question he had not decided to answer yet. A bus passed, wind brushing against his sleeve. Someone laughed across the street. A delivery bike cut through traffic with sharp precision. All of it normal, all of it grounding. And yet the memory of the room upstairs stayed with him. Not the screens, not the numbers, but the silence, the kind that meant something had changed. He reached the next building just as the clock aligned with his estimate, pushing the door open with his shoulder, stepping into another lobby, smaller, less polished, but familiar in a way the last one had not been. The receptionist here barely looked up, just pointed to the sign-in sheet. And that was enough. Daniel wrote his name, clear, steady, then moved toward the elevators again. Just another delivery, just another stop in a day that did not pause for reflection. But as he waited, his phone buzzed lightly in his pocket. He pulled it out, expecting a routine notification, but instead it was a message from his son's school. A reminder about a science project due the next morning. Daniel read it twice, then smiled faintly. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough to soften the edges of his day. He typed a quick reply to confirm, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. The elevator arrived, doors opening with a simple chime, and as he stepped inside, the world settled back into its usual rhythm. But somewhere between the floors, between responsibility and possibility, the quiet weight of that card remained, not demanding, not urgent, just waiting. The afternoon light had started to soften by the time Daniel finished his last delivery. The sharp edges of the city easing into something quieter, less demanding. He stepped out onto the sidewalk and paused for a moment. Not because he was tired, but because for the first time all day, there was nothing immediate pulling him forward, no address to reach, no clock pressing against his back, just a brief space where he could stand still. He reached into his jacket and felt the card between his fingers, smooth, simple, unassuming. He turned it over once, reading the name again. Victoria Hale. The number beneath it clean and direct, no extra words, no instructions, just an opening left intentionally unfinished. Daniel exhaled slowly, looking up at the street, people passing, conversations blending into a low, constant hum. A man pushing a cart of tools, a woman balancing two coffees, a child laughing somewhere just out of view. The world continued exactly as it had before, unchanged by what had happened hours earlier. And yet the card in his hand suggested something that did not quite fit into that rhythm. He slipped it back into his pocket, not deciding yet, not rejecting it either, just letting it sit there, like something that would wait until he was ready. The walk home was familiar, streets he had taken hundreds of times, small details he no longer needed to notice consciously. The corner store, with its flickering sign, the narrow alley that always smelled faintly of detergent and metal, the worn steps leading up to his building. Everything steady, predictable, grounding in a way that did not require thought. Inside, the apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned rather than empty. Daniel set his keys down, placed his bag near the door, and moved toward the kitchen, the clock on the wall ticking softly, marking time in a way that felt different from the sharp precision of the office earlier. He poured a glass of water, leaned lightly against the counter, and closed his eyes for a second, just enough to reset. Then he heard it, the small sound of movement from the other room. Light, quick, familiar. "Dad?" The voice came, Curious, warm, Daniel opened his eyes and turned, his son standing in the doorway, holding a sheet of paper covered in careful handwriting and uneven diagrams. "You are late," the boy said, not accusing, just stating what he had noticed. Daniel smiled slightly, setting the glass down. "A little," he admitted, stepping closer. "I had something unexpected come up." The boy nodded as if that made sense, then held up the paper. "I need help with this," he said, pointing to a section filled with small numbers and arrows. Daniel took the paper, scanning it quickly, not rushing, just understanding. "What is it about?" he asked, even though he could already see the structure. "Energy transfer," his son replied. "But I do not get how it moves." Without getting lost, Daniel crouched slightly so they were eye level, the paper between them. "It does not get lost," he said gently. "It just needs the right path." The boy frowned, thinking, then looked back at the page. Daniel pointed to one of the diagrams, adjusting it slightly, simplifying the flow, removing what was not needed, his movements calm, patient, the same way he had approached the system earlier, but softer, more personal. "See this?" he said. "If you stop it from going in circles, it moves forward." The boy's eyes lit just a little, not fully understanding yet, but closer. "Oh," he said quietly. And in that small moment, in that simple exchange between father and son, the same principle that had saved a system worth millions found its place in something much smaller, and somehow, much more important. Daniel glanced at the clock again, then at his son, and for a brief second, the card in his pocket felt different, not heavier, not urgent, just connected to a choice he had not made yet. The evening settled in quietly, not with a sudden shift, but with a gradual softening of everything around them. The light outside the window dimming into a calm blue that filled the apartment with a gentle stillness. Daniel sat at the small kitchen table across from his son, the paper between them now covered with small corrections, arrows that made more sense, paths that moved forward instead of circling back on themselves. His son leaned over it, focused, lips moving slightly as he traced the flow again in his own way, trying to understand it not just by seeing it, but by feeling how it worked. Daniel watched him for a moment, not interrupting, not adding anything more, just letting the process take hold, because he knew that understanding did not come from being told. It came from seeing something clearly enough that it stayed. "So it does not disappear," his son said finally, looking up. "It just needs direction." Daniel nodded once, a small confirmation. "Exactly," he said, his voice low, steady. The boy smiled faintly, satisfied in that quiet way children do when something clicks without needing celebration. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, the tension of the day easing in his shoulders, not gone, but quieter, more manageable. His eyes drifted toward the window for a second, the reflection of the room faintly visible against the glass. And then, almost without thinking, his hand moved to his jacket hanging on the back of the chair, his fingers brushing against the card again. Still there, still waiting. He pulled it out this time, holding it between his fingers, turning it over once more as if it might say something new. But it did not. It stayed the same, simple, direct, offering nothing except a choice. His son noticed, tilting his head slightly. "What is that?" he asked, curious but not pressing. Daniel looked at the card for a second longer before answering. "Just something from work," he said, not hiding it, but not explaining it fully either. His son nodded, accepting that easily. Children often did not need full answers, just enough to feel included. "Are you going to use it?" the boy asked after a moment. Daniel did not answer right away, not because he did not hear the question, but because he understood it was not just about the card. It was about what came with it: change, possibility, something beyond the routine that had kept their life steady. He placed the card gently on the table, not putting it away, not committing to it, just letting it sit there where it could be seen. "I do not know yet," he said honestly. His son looked at it, then back at him. "If it helps us, you should," he said simply. No pressure, no expectation, just a quiet statement of trust. Daniel felt that more than anything that had been said all day, more than the silence in the office, more than the shift in the room, this small voice, this simple perspective, it grounded everything. He nodded once, not as a decision, but as acknowledgement, then reached for his phone, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving when the moment felt right. He unlocked it, stared at the screen for a second, then typed in the number from memory rather than looking at the card again. His thumb hovered for a brief second over the call button, not out of fear, but because he understood that this was the point where something would begin to move, and once it did, it would not return to where it had been. He pressed it. The line began to ring. 1, 2, 3 times, each tone steady, measured, and in the quiet space between those rings, Daniel sat there at the table, his son beside him, the evening wrapped around them, waiting for whatever came next. The line clicked softly, and then her voice came through, clear, composed, exactly as it had been in that room earlier. "Victoria Hale," she said, not rushed, not questioning, as if she had been expecting the call without needing to confirm it. Daniel held the phone steady against his ear, his gaze drifting briefly to his son who watched him with quiet curiosity from across the table. "This is Daniel," he said, simple. No extra words. There was a brief pause on the other end, not uncertainty, but recognition settling into place. "I was wondering if you would call," she replied, her tone unchanged, but there was something softer beneath it now, something less formal. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, not relaxing fully, just enough to breathe. "I said I would," he answered, and that was enough to bridge the space between them. No introduction needed, no explanation of what had happened earlier, because both of them already understood the weight of it. Victoria shifted slightly on her end, the faint sound of movement in a large room, distant, controlled. "Are you available tomorrow morning?" she asked, direct, the question carrying purpose without pressure. Daniel glanced at the clock on the wall, then at his son, who was now pretending not to listen but clearly paying attention to every word. "I start work at 8, he said, honest, not adjusting his reality to fit the opportunity. There was a short pause. Then, "Come in before your shift," she said, 7:30. No negotiation, but not a demand either, just a time placed between them. Daniel considered it, calculating again, the distance, the route, the time it would take to get there and still keep everything else intact. "I can be there," he said, steady. Victoria exhaled softly, almost imperceptible. "Good," she replied, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the important part had already been decided. Then she added, quieter this time. "Daniel," he responded with a small shift in tone, attentive. "Yes." There was a pause, just long enough to carry meaning. "Thank you for not walking away today," she said, not as a formality, not as a corporate courtesy, but as something more personal, something that did not come easily from someone used to control. Daniel looked down at the table, at the paper his son had been working on, the lines now clearer, the path no longer looping. "I almost did," he admitted, his voice calm, unguarded. There was a faint change on the other end of the line, not surprise, but understanding. "I am glad you did not," she said, and that was all. No grand statement, no promise of what tomorrow would bring, just a simple acknowledgement of a moment that had shifted something for both of them. Daniel nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. "I will see you in the morning," he said, and she responded, 7:30. Before the line ended with a soft click, the room returned to its quiet, the hum of the evening settling back in. Daniel lowered the phone slowly, placing it on the table beside the card. His son looked at him, eyes bright with a question he did not need to ask. Daniel met his gaze, a small smile forming, not wide, not loud, but real. "We might need to wake up a little earlier tomorrow," he said. His son grinned, not fully understanding what was coming, but trusting it anyway. And in that quiet kitchen, between a simple table and a single decision, something had already begun to move forward, not fast, not loudly, but in the only way that ever truly lasted, steady, clear, and without needing to prove itself.